My wife of 25 years dropped the divorce papers onto my paralyzed legs before the anesthesia from my spinal surgery had even worn off, telling me she refused to waste her beauty on a bankrupt cripple. I am 64 years old, staring at a $100,000 hospital bill I cannot pay after losing my $50 million construction firm to a partner who forged my signature while I lay unconscious in this ICU. She didn't realize that the head of neurosurgery was standing in the shadows of the hallway, clutching a vintage scholarship ledger from 20 years ago that contained my name and a debt he never forgot. My name is Arthur Vance, and for 3 decades, I was the man who built the skyline of Chicago, moving mountains of steel and concrete while thinking my family was as solid as the foundations I poured. I spent my life in work boots and silk ties, growing Vance Construction from a single-used crane into a regional powerhouse, never imagining that the people I loved most were just waiting for my empire to fall. I lived in a sprawling estate in Lake Forest with a woman I thought was my soulmate, providing every luxury imaginable while I worked 14-hour days to ensure our future was secured against any possible storm. My fatal flaw was a blind trust in the people I shared my table with, assuming that loyalty was a natural byproduct of the massive sacrifices I made to keep our family at the top of society. The collapse happened with a speed that still makes my head spin, starting with a quiet audit and ending with federal agents telling me that my company was nothing more than a hollowed-out shell of debt. My partner, Marcus, was the man I trusted with every ledger and bank account for 2 decades, but he spent the last 18 months moving our capital into offshore accounts while I was focused on building. When the bank moved to seize our personal assets, I was already a broken man, sitting in my mahogany office watching movers carry away the furniture I bought when our son, Tyler, was just a small boy. I decided to drive to Tyler's house in the middle of a blinding November sleet storm, steering my old work truck toward the only person I thought would offer me a place to rest my weary head. The roads were a sheet of black ice near the interstate junction, and as I reached for my phone to call him, a semi-truck jackknifed directly in front of me, leaving me nowhere to go. The impact was a deafening roar of twisting metal and shattering glass that felt like the world was ending, followed by a terrifying silence where I realized I couldn't feel anything below my heavy, crushed chest. I woke up 3 days later in a sterile room at Memorial Hospital, surrounded by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the smell of industrial cleaner, only to find my wife, Brenda, standing by the window. She wasn't there to hold my hand or tell me everything would be all right. She was checking her reflection in the glass and complaining about how the hospital parking lot had ruined her expensive designer suede heels. Brenda walked to the side of my bed with a coldness I had never seen before, tossing a thick envelope onto my lap and explaining that she had already moved her things into a new penthouse. I didn't sign up for a life of poverty or changing the bedpans of a man who can't even stand up, she said, her voice sounding like a stranger's as she checked her gold watch. She told me the lawyers had already finalized the separation of what little remained, ensuring she walked away with the hidden jewelry and the last of the liquid cash I had kept in our home safe. I tried to speak, to ask about our son, but my throat felt like it was filled with dry sand and the weight of 1,000 heartbreaks as I watched her walk out of the room. 10 minutes later, Tyler walked in, but he didn't look like the son I had coached through baseball games and paid for an Ivy League education. He looked like a man who was deeply inconvenienced. He stood by the door, refusing to come closer to the bed, telling me that his wife's family was very prestigious and having a bankrupt, paralyzed father in their guest room would simply be too much. We have a reputation to maintain in the city, Dad, and honestly, you being like this is going to make the upcoming charity gala very awkward for everyone involved in our social circle, he whispered. He explained that he had already looked into some state-funded nursing homes on the outskirts of the county, places where I could live out my days without being a constant reminder of our family's failure. I watched my only child turn his back on me, leaving me alone in a room where I couldn't even reach the call button to ask the nurse for a glass of cold, soothing water. The nurses began treating me differently once they realized no family was coming back, their voices becoming brisk and impatient as they hurried through my care like I was just another chore on their list. The physical therapist told me that without private insurance or a massive cash deposit, my chances of ever walking again were slim to none because the advanced robotic rehabilitation was reserved for the wealthy. I lay there for 2 nights in total darkness, listening to the sounds of the hospital and wondering how a man who built hospitals and schools could be discarded like a piece of broken, useless construction scrap. The bills began to pile up on my bedside table, colorful notices from the laboratory and the surgical department that served as constant reminders that I was drowning in a debt I would never be able to pay. I remembered the times I had written checks for millions to help local charities, yet now I was being told that I might be moved to a facility with a history of neglect and poor conditions. On the third morning, a young resident doctor came in and looked at my chart with a sigh, telling me that the hospital administration was already pushing for my discharge to the state-run nursing facility. He didn't look me in the eye when he said it, focusing instead on the screen of his tablet, and I realized that to the world, Arthur Vance was already a ghost who hadn't died yet. I felt a surge of hot, bitter anger that finally broke through my despair, a reminder that I was still the man who had survived the cutthroat world of Chicago business for over 30 long years. I asked the resident for a phone, but he just shook his head and said that the hospital phones were for emergencies only and that I should use my personal cell if I needed to call someone. My cell phone had been crushed in the accident, and the realization that I was truly cut off from the world hit me like a second physical blow to my already shattered and broken spinal column. Just as the resident was about to leave, the door swung open and a tall man in a pristine white lab coat walked in, followed by a trail of high-level administrators who looked incredibly nervous. The man had graying hair at his temples and a pair of sharp, intelligent eyes that immediately locked onto mine with an intensity that made the air in the room feel suddenly very still and heavy. He didn't look at the tablet or the charts hanging at the foot of my bed. He walked straight to me and placed a firm, warm hand on my shoulder, looking at me with genuine recognition. "Mr. Vance, I was informed this morning that you were a patient on this floor, and I could not believe my eyes when I saw your name on the emergency intake list for this week," he said. The hospital director stepped forward, trying to explain that I was being prepped for transfer due to my lack of insurance, but the man in the white coat held up a hand to silence him. "This man is not going anywhere except the private executive suite on the top floor, and his care will be the highest priority of every specialist in this building starting this very second," he commanded. I squinted at him, trying to place the face, but the fog of the medication and the trauma of the accident made it difficult to connect the dots of a memory from 20 years ago. He noticed my confusion and smiled, a soft and kind expression that stood in stark contrast to the coldness I had received from my wife and my only son just a few hours before. "My name is Dr. Elias Miller, Arthur, and though it has been a long time, I have never forgotten the man who changed the entire trajectory of my life when I had absolutely nothing." The administrators scrambled to follow his orders, suddenly treating me like royalty as they began moving my bed toward the elevator that led to the most exclusive and advanced wing of the entire hospital. Dr. Miller stayed by my side during the move, telling the staff to ignore the billing department and that he would personally guarantee every single cent of my medical expenses from his own private fund. Once we were in the quiet luxury of the executive suite, he sat down in the chair next to my bed and pulled a worn, laminated newspaper clipping out of his leather wallet to show me. It was a photo of me from 20 years ago, standing at a podium at a community college, handing out scholarship checks to 5 students who had grown up in the city's poorest and toughest neighborhoods. Elias pointed to the skinny, nervous kid standing on the far left of the photo, a boy who looked like he hadn't had a decent meal in weeks, but had eyes full of desperate, burning ambition. I was 22 years old, working 3 jobs and about to drop out of school because I couldn't afford the tuition for my senior year. "And then you showed up like an angel," Elias said. He explained that my scholarship didn't just pay for his undergraduate degree. It came with a personal note that told him to never stop reaching for the top and a check for his medical school. "You told me that day that the world needs builders, Arthur, and you told me that my mind was the most powerful tool I would ever own if I learned how to use it correctly." I felt tears stinging my eyes as I listened to him, the first bit of warmth I had felt since the accident, realizing that a small act of kindness from my past was coming back to save me. Elias told me that he had spent the last 2 decades becoming the most sought-after neurosurgeon in the country, but he had always kept tabs on the man who had given him his first break. He knew about the betrayal by Marcus and the bankruptcy, because he had been planning to reach out to me before the accident happened, but the crash had forced his hand much sooner than expected. I have already contacted the best legal team in the state, men who specialize in corporate fraud and asset recovery, and they are already starting to track down exactly where Marcus hid your money. He looked at my legs and promised me that the paralysis wasn't necessarily permanent, that the surgeons downstairs had missed a specific compression point that he was trained to fix with a new procedure. The people who walked out on you think you are finished, Arthur, but they have no idea that the foundation you built for others is what is going to hold you up now, Elias whispered. He pulled out his phone and made a call, and within minutes, 3 men in expensive suits walked into the room, carrying briefcases and looking like they were ready to go to war for me. They were the attorneys Elias had mentioned, and they told me that Marcus had made a massive mistake by using a bank that Dr. Miller's family had been board members of for several generations. They already had proof that the signatures on the loan documents were forged, and they were preparing to file an emergency injunction to freeze every single one of Marcus's personal and business accounts by morning. I felt a sense of power returning to my bones, a spark of the old Arthur Vance who knew how to fight and win, and I realized that my life wasn't over. It was just changing. Elias told me that my wife had tried to sell my vintage car collection that afternoon, but his team had already blocked the sale and had the titles moved into a protected trust in my name. He also mentioned that my son, Tyler, had called the hospital to check on my transfer status, and Elias had personally informed him that I was no longer a patient they needed to worry about. We told him you were being moved to a high-security facility and that his access was being permanently revoked per the patient's new legal directives, Elias said with a satisfied and very sharp smile. I spent the next 4 hours working with the lawyers, providing details about the company's internal servers and the secret passwords Marcus thought I had forgotten during my long months of focused building. The legal team was amazed by my memory, noting that every detail I provided was a nail in the coffin of the man who had tried to ruin me while I was at my most vulnerable. Elias checked my vitals again, his face glowing with a professional pride, and he told me that we would be heading into surgery the following morning to begin the process of restoring my mobility. You spent your life building structures that people could live in, Arthur, and now it is my turn to rebuild the structure that allows you to live your own life with full dignity. He stayed with me until I fell asleep, a sentinel at the door who ensured that no one from my past life could get near me to cause any more emotional or physical pain or distress. The next morning, as they wheeled me toward the operating theater, I saw Brenda and Tyler standing in the lobby, arguing with the security guards who were refusing to let them past the front desk. They looked desperate and small from my vantage point on the gurney. Their expensive clothes and arrogant attitudes mean nothing in a place where life and death are decided by skill and true loyalty. I didn't say a word to them, simply looking away as the elevator doors closed, feeling a sense of peace that I hadn't known even when I was at the very height of my massive financial success. The surgery lasted 8 hours, a complex dance of lasers and microscopic sutures that Elias performed with the precision of a master craftsman who knew exactly what was at stake for his old mentor. When I woke up in recovery, the first thing I felt was a sharp, tingling sensation in my right big toe, a tiny spark of electricity that told me the bridge had been successfully rebuilt. Elias was there, his surgical mask hanging around his neck, and a look of pure triumph on his face as he watched me wiggle my foot for the first time since the horrific highway crash. He leaned in close, ignoring the security guard, and whispered that he still had the letter I wrote him in 1998 when I paid for his final 3 years of medical school. My recovery was not just about the physical mending of bone and nerve, but about the cold, calculated restoration of a man who had been left for dead by his own family members. Elias introduced me to Sarah, a physical therapist with a drill sergeant's attitude and a heart of gold, who promised that we would walk through the fire of rehabilitation together every single day. Every morning began with the smell of antiseptic and the sound of my own heavy breathing as I struggled to make my toes move just a fraction of an inch against the sheets. The pain was a constant, throbbing companion that reminded me I was still alive, a sharp contrast to the numb silence I had felt when Brenda tossed those divorce papers onto my lap. My legal team, led by a shark named Harrison, set up a war room in the suite next door, their glowing computer screens reflecting the complex web of Marcus's many financial crimes. They found that my partner had been creating fake subcontractors for 5 years, funneling millions of dollars into a private offshore account, while I was busy managing the actual construction sites in Chicago. Even more devastating was the discovery that Brenda had known about the embezzlement for months, staying silent because Marcus had promised her a significant cut of the stolen wealth once I was gone. I felt a hollow ache in my chest that had nothing to do with my injuries, realizing that 25 years of marriage had been sold for a stack of blood-stained American $100 bills. Tyler called the hospital 3 times a day once he heard that the FBI was asking questions about the company's missing funds, his voice sounding small and terrified for the very first time. He didn't care about my health or my recovery. He only cared that his trust fund was being frozen and that his high society friends were starting to whisper about his father's sudden bankruptcy. I instructed Harrison to ignore my son's desperate pleas for money, because Tyler needed to learn that a man's character is built on his own merits, not on the inheritance he expects. By the third week, Sarah had me standing in a set of parallel bars, my trembling hands clutching the cold metal as I tried to remember how to balance my own heavy weight. The first time I stood up, the world seemed to tilt and spin, but Elias was there to catch me, his eyes full of a fierce pride that my own son never possessed. "You built skyscrapers that can withstand hurricanes, Arthur, so don't you dare tell me that a little bit of gravity is going to be the thing that finally brings you down," Sarah shouted. I pushed through the exhaustion until my vision blurred, driven by the image of Brenda's cold smile and the way she had looked at her reflection while I lay there broken and helpless. Harrison walked in one afternoon with a laptop, showing me a digital trail of messages between Marcus and a mechanic who had worked on my truck just 2 days before the horrific accident. It appeared that my brake lines hadn't just failed due to the icy conditions. They had been intentionally weakened to ensure I wouldn't survive the drive to Tyler's house in that blinding storm. The realization that they had tried to murder me for my life insurance policy turned my sadness into a cold, hard diamond of rage that gave me a new kind of terrifying strength. I told Elias that I wanted the most aggressive treatment possible, regardless of the cost or the pain, because I had a date with justice that I simply could not afford to miss. Brenda tried to force her way into the executive wing the next morning, screaming at the security guards that she was still my legal wife and had every right to see her husband. I watched her on the security monitor, her face twisted in a mask of fake concern that didn't reach her eyes, which were darting around looking for anything she could still steal. I picked up the bedside phone and told the head of security to inform her that her presence was a health hazard and that she should expect a countersuit by sunset. The look of pure shock on her face when the guard handed her the restraining order was a moment of satisfaction that felt better than any pain medication the doctors could prescribe. Tyler showed up an hour later, dressed in a suit I had bought him, trying to play the role of the devoted son who had just been misunderstood during his previous, heartless hospital visit. "Dad, I was just in shock when I saw you in the ICU, and I didn't mean those things I said about the charity gala or the state-funded nursing home," he stammered. I didn't even let him sit down, telling him that his Ivy League education should have taught him that once a bridge is burned, the person who lit the fire stays on the other side. I watched him walk away through the glass window of my suite, realizing that I had raised a stranger who valued his social standing more than the life of the man who provided it. Sarah increased the intensity of our sessions, moving me from the parallel bars to a walker, and then finally to a set of forearm crutches that felt like wings in my bruised hands. Every step was a battle against the scar tissue and the trauma, but I kept picturing the look on Marcus's face when I finally walked into the boardroom to reclaim my stolen throne. Harrison discovered that Marcus had used the stolen company funds to buy a massive yacht, naming it the Clean Break, which was a level of arrogance that made my blood boil. We let him continue his spending spree for another week, allowing him to dig a hole so deep that not even the best high-priced defense attorney in the country could pull him out. Elias checked my progress every evening, marveling at the way my nerves were regenerating, calling it a miracle of modern medicine and the sheer, stubborn will of a man seeking righteous vengeance. I spent my nights studying the company ledgers that Harrison's team had recovered from a hidden server, finding the smoking gun that linked Marcus's offshore accounts directly to the brake line tampering. An old secretary named Martha, who I had treated like family for 20 years, reached out to Elias and admitted she had copies of the original contracts Marcus had tried to destroy. She had been too afraid to speak up while I was unconscious, but seeing my recovery in the local business news gave her the courage to bring the evidence to the district attorney. Martha visited me in the hospital, crying as she handed over a thumb drive that contained every forged signature and every secret meeting log Marcus had ever kept during his long betrayal. "He told us you were never coming back, Arthur, and he threatened to ruin anyone who didn't follow his new orders," she whispered, her hands shaking as I held them in mine. I told her that her loyalty would be rewarded and that once the company was back in my hands, she would never have to worry about her retirement or her family's security. The following Monday, The FBI raided the Vance construction headquarters, led by the evidence we had meticulously gathered while Marcus was busy celebrating his perceived victory on his new, expensive yacht. I watched the live news coverage from my hospital bed, seeing Marcus being let out in handcuffs, his expensive silk tie crooked, and his face a pale shade of terrified, ghostly white. Brenda called me 40 times that night, her voice frantic as she realized that her meal ticket was headed to a federal prison and that her Miami condo was being seized. I didn't answer a single call, instead focusing on the way my legs felt as I practiced walking across the room without the help of the crutches for the very first time. It was a slow, deliberate movement, a testament to the thousands of hours of pain and the unwavering support of a doctor who remembered a kindness from 2 decades ago in Chicago. The hospital staff gathered in the hallway to watch me, cheering as I reached the door and turned back to look at the bed where I had once thought I would die. Elias stood at the end of the hall, holding a pair of brand new work boots that he had bought for me, a symbol that my time as a patient was officially coming to an end. "You have a company to rebuild and a family to settle accounts with, Arthur, and I think it is time you did it on your own 2 feet, Elias said. I put on those boots and felt the familiar weight of them, a reminder of the man I used to be and the much stronger man I had become through this trial by fire. The first place I went was the old construction site of the hospital's new pediatric wing, a project Marcus had halted because he wanted to divert the funds into his own private pockets. I stood in the dirt and the gravel, surrounded by the smell of diesel and the sound of hammers, feeling more at home than I had in the Lake Forest mansion. The foreman recognized me immediately, dropping his clipboard in shock as he saw the man the news had reported as permanently paralyzed standing right there in front of his very eyes. "The boss is back, and we are going to finish this building ahead of schedule and under budget, just like we always used to do," I told the cheering, dusty crew. I hired a private investigator to track Brenda's every move, finding out that she had already tried to pawn the engagement ring I had given her on our 10th anniversary for cash. I had my lawyers buy the ring back from the pawn shop, not because I wanted the jewelry, but because I wanted to hand it back to her during the final hearing. Tyler showed up at the construction site, looking disheveled and desperate, begging for a job because his wife's family had completely disowned him after the scandal broke in the papers. He told me he was willing to start at the bottom, doing manual labor or sweeping the floors, just to have a steady paycheck and a way to support his newborn daughter. I looked at my son and saw a stranger, a man who only found his humility when he ran out of other people's money to spend on his own shallow and selfish lifestyle. "You can work for me, Tyler, but you will live in a studio apartment and earn every cent through sweat, just like I did when I was your age," I said. He accepted the offer with tears in his eyes, but I knew it would take years of hard, honest work before I could ever trust him to sit at my table. The legal battle for the company assets was grueling, but with Martha's evidence and Harrison's relentless tactics, we managed to claw back every single dollar that Marcus had tried to steal. Marcus was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security facility, with no possibility of parole, ensuring he would be an old man before he ever saw the Chicago skyline again. On the day the divorce was finalized, I sat across from Brenda in a cold, wood-paneled office, watching as she realized she was leaving with nothing but her own bitter regrets. She tried to make a final plea for alimony, talking about this standard of living she had become accustomed to during our 25 years of marriage in that massive Lake Forest estate. I stood up and walked around the table, leaning in close so she could see the lack of pity in my eyes, and handed her the pawned engagement ring in a small bag. "You sold our history for pennies, Brenda. So now you can take this piece of glass and use it to figure out how you are going to survive the next 20 years. She left the office crying, and for the first time in months, I felt the weight of her betrayal lift off my shoulders like a heavy, suffocating blanket of cold and dark. I returned to the hospital that evening, but not as a patient. I was there to hand Elias a check for $10 million to start a new scholarship fund for students. "You saved my life twice, Elias. Once when you were a student, and once when you were a surgeon, and I want to make sure the next generation has that same chance." He tried to refuse the money, but I told him that a builder's work is never done and that we were just getting started on the most important project of our entire lives. We sat on the balcony of the executive suite, looking out over the city lights, 2 men who had been connected by a single act of kindness that had spanned 2 decades. I realized then that the true measure of a man isn't the height of the buildings he creates, but the strength of the people he helps stand up when they fall. My name is Arthur Vance, and And while my body may have been broken by an accident and a betrayal, my spirit has never been more solid or more determined to succeed. I am 64 years old, and I am finally building a life that is based on truth, loyalty, and the kind of love that doesn't require a bank account to survive. The recovery was long, and the scars will always be there to remind me of what I lost, but I wouldn't trade the man I am now for the man I was. As the sun set over the Chicago skyline, I looked at the city I had helped build and realized that my greatest construction project was finally the rebuilding of myself. I watched the sunrise from the window of my new penthouse, which was smaller than the Lake Forest mansion, but filled with a peace that no amount of gold or marble could ever provide. My attorneys informed me that Brenda had filed a desperate petition to overturn our divorce settlement, claiming that she had signed the documents under extreme emotional distress during my long hospital stay. I simply authorized Harrison to release the video footage of her tossing the divorce papers onto my paralyzed legs, a move that silenced her legal team and ended her remaining claims forever. She was left with nothing but the clothes on her back and the bitter realization that her beauty was a fading currency in a world that finally valued character over superficial appearances. Tyler was now working on a framing crew in the suburbs of Chicago, waking up at 5 in the morning to haul heavy lumber in the freezing rain for $12 an hour. He sent me a photo of his blistered hands with a short note that said he finally understood why I used to fall asleep at the dinner table after a long shift. I didn't invite him to my Thanksgiving dinner, but I did send a large crate of groceries and warm winter coats for his daughter, ensuring the child didn't suffer for his mistakes. The Vance Construction headquarters was officially reopened in a refurbished warehouse in the West Loop, a building with history and character that matched the new direction of my life and business. Every single employee who had stayed loyal during the Marcus takeover was given a significant bonus and a seat at the table as we began planning our next major urban development. Elias visited the office once a week, often bringing a group of medical students who were interested in how large-scale construction could improve the overall health outcomes of struggling urban neighborhoods. We began working on a plan to build affordable housing for seniors, ensuring that no one would ever have to worry about being discarded in a state-run facility like I almost was. The project was named the Miller-Vance Initiative, a partnership that combined my structural expertise with Elias's deep understanding of human dignity and the essential need for a safe, stable home. I saw Marcus one last time during his final sentencing hearing, sitting behind a glass partition in a jumpsuit that was a far cry from the tailored Italian suits he used to wear. He tried to apologize, claiming that the pressure of the business had clouded his judgment, but I walked away before he could finish his sentence because his words no longer had power. I took a long weekend to drive through the small towns of the Midwest, visiting the sites of my very first projects and remembering the man who used to dream of skyscrapers. I realized that while I had built many grand things, my most important legacy was the way I treated the people who depended on me for their livelihoods and their future security. The physical therapy continued to be a daily ritual of sweat and determination, but I was now able to walk 3 miles without a cane, much to the amazement of Sarah. She told me I was her most stubborn patient, but I just laughed and reminded her that a man who survives a mountain of betrayal isn't going to let a sidewalk stop him. Brenda's sister eventually called me to say that Brenda was working at a diner in a small town, serving coffee to truckers and living in a trailer park behind a bowling alley. I didn't feel joy at her misfortune, only a quiet sense of closure, knowing that the universe has a way of balancing the scales when we finally stop fighting for the wrong things. I focused my energy on the scholarship fund, which had grown to support 50 students a year, all of whom were required to spend 10 hours a week volunteering in their communities. One of the students wrote me a letter saying that my story had given him the courage to stand up to a corrupt landlord who was trying to evict his elderly grandmother. That letter meant more to me than the $300 million contract we had just signed to renovate the city's aging transit system and provide thousands of new jobs for local workers. I sat down with Tyler for the first time in 6 months, meeting him at a Greasy Spoon diner near his job site during his 30-minute lunch break on a Tuesday. He didn't ask for money or a promotion. He simply asked if I could show him how to read a blueprint properly so he could understand the bones of the buildings he framed. For the first time in years, I saw a flash of my own reflection in his eyes, a spark of genuine interest that wasn't motivated by greed or the need for approval. I spent the next hour teaching him about load-bearing walls and the importance of a solid foundation, realizing that we were finally starting to build something real between a father and son. The hospital wing for pediatric neurology was finally completed, a stunning glass and steel structure that looked like it was floating above the city streets on a bed of soft light. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Elias stood next to me, and as we cut the ribbon together, the crowd of doctors and nurses erupted into a roar of cheers and genuine celebration. I looked out at the faces of the children who would be treated there and realized that my accident was the catalyst for a much greater good than I could have ever imagined. I was no longer the king of construction who cared about power and prestige. I was a man who understood that true wealth is found in the lives we touch along the way. I received a subpoena to testify in a massive racketeering case against several of Marcus's former associates, men who had profited from the destruction of my company and the theft of funds. I sat on the witness stand for 3 days, providing a calm and detailed account of the corruption that had almost cost me my life and the lives of my loyal, hard-working employees. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict for every single one of them, ensuring that the poison was finally drained from the Chicago construction industry forever. I walked out of the courthouse and felt the cool autumn breeze on my face, knowing that I had done my duty to the city and the people who trusted my name. My name, Arthur Vance, once stood for a fallen empire, but now it stood for a resurrection that inspired everyone who had ever been knocked down by the cruelty of this world. I celebrated my 65th birthday in the canteen of the new housing project, eating cake off a paper plate with the men and women who were actually building the future with me. Elias presented me with a framed copy of my first business license from 40 years ago, which he had tracked down through a series of old city records and dusty government archives. It was a reminder of where I started, a young man with a single truck and a dream of making a difference in the city that he loved with all of his heart. I realized that I had finally come full circle, returning to the simple joys of hard work and honest relationships that had been lost in the pursuit of more and more money. Tyler was promoted to lead man on his crew, a position he earned through 300 days of perfect attendance and a willingness to learn from every mistake that he had made. He called me to say that he had saved enough money to buy his daughter a bicycle for her birthday, his voice thick with a pride that money could never buy from anyone. I told him I was proud of him, the first time those words had felt honest in a decade, and I invited him to come to the office to help with the designs. We began working on a memorial garden for the hospital, a quiet place where families could find peace and strength during the most difficult moments of their own personal and private lives. I donated my old Lake Forest estate to a charity that provided housing for disabled veterans, turning a place of betrayal into a sanctuary for men who had sacrificed everything for us. The movers took the last of Brenda's designer furniture and donated it to a local shelter, ensuring that her vanity would finally serve a purpose by helping those who had absolutely nothing. I felt lighter with every room that was emptied, as if the ghosts of my old life were being purged from the walls and replaced with a new sense of hope and service. I took a long walk through the garden of the new pediatric wing, watching as the first group of patients moved into their rooms and began their own difficult journeys toward healing. One little boy in a wheelchair waved at me from a window, his smile so bright that it made all the pain of the last year seem like a very small price. I realized that I wasn't just a builder of skyscrapers anymore. I was a builder of hope, a man who used his second chance to make sure others got theirs as well. Harrison called to tell me that Marcus had tried to file for an early release based on poor health, but the request was denied because of the severity of his financial crimes. I felt no malice toward him, only a profound sense of relief that the justice system had worked and that he was finally being held accountable for the lives he had ruined. I spent an evening looking through old photo albums, seeing the faces of the people I used to know and realizing how much I had changed since the day of the icy crash. I was no longer afraid of being alone or losing my status, because I had discovered a strength that was internal and unshakable, regardless of what happened in the outside and cruel world. Elias and I went fishing on a quiet lake in Wisconsin, sitting in silence for hours as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to twinkle in the sky. He told me that he was planning to retire from surgery in a few years to focus entirely on the scholarship fund and the housing projects we had started together in Chicago. We made a pact to keep building as long as we were able, two men who had been brought together by a scholarship check and a horrific accident on a dark, icy road. I stood on the roof of my newest building, looking out at the city that I had helped shape and feeling a sense of deep and lasting gratitude for every single moment. The wind was cold, but it felt good against my skin, a reminder that I was still standing and that my foundation was stronger than it had ever been in my life. I thought about the first 3 lines of this story. The moment Brenda dropped those papers in my life seemed to end in a sterile hospital room surrounded by cold, hard machines. I realized that those papers weren't an ending, but a graduation from a life of illusions into a life of truth and meaningful connections that actually mattered to my soul and spirit. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, worn scholarship ledger that Elias had given me, a book that contained the names of everyone we had helped over the years. I added a new name to the list, a young man from the housing project who wanted to become an architect and design buildings that were accessible and beautiful for everyone to enjoy. I knew that my time on this earth was limited, but I also knew that the buildings and the people I left behind would carry my story forward for many, many generations. I walked down the stairs instead of taking the elevator, my legs moving with a steady and confident rhythm that was a testament to the power of the human heart and will. I drove my new truck to the diner where Brenda worked, not to confront her, but to leave a $500 tip on the table for the waitress who was struggling. I saw Brenda through the kitchen window, her hair graying and her shoulders slumped, and I finally let go of the last piece of anger that I had been carrying for her. I drove away into the night, the lights of the city sparkling in my rearview mirror like diamonds scattered on a velvet cloth of darkness and hope and new beginning. My name is Arthur Vance, and I am a builder who has learned that the most important structures are the ones we build inside ourselves to weather the storms of this life. I am 65 years old, and for the first time in my long and complicated life, I am exactly where I am supposed to be, surrounded by people who truly love me. The future is no longer a source of anxiety or fear, but a blank blueprint that I am excited to fill with new designs and new opportunities to serve the people around me. I am grateful for the betrayal, the accident, and the pain, because they were the fires that forged me into a man who finally knows the true value of a single day. I am walking toward the light with my head held high, knowing that I have fought the good fight and that my legacy is secure in the hearts of those I helped. The story of the paralyzed CEO is over, but the story of the man who found his soul in the wreckage of his empire is just beginning to find its true and final voice. Let me tell you one last thing. Never underestimate a man who has nothing left to lose, because that is exactly when he becomes the most powerful and unstoppable force in existence.